So welcome. This is all about database DevOps. It is possible. Was anybody at the session earlier about the database and the bottleneck for DevOps? A few hands. Was anyone at the previous Delphix session on test data management? Okay, great. So yeah, really good sessions, and I'm so excited to be at this conference and hear more and more sessions talking about the database and including that in DevOps processes, because it's a really important part of the application. My name is Stephanie Herr. I'm the product manager for database DevOps at Redgate. But before that, I spent 10 years as a database developer, and now this is going back 20 years. This was at a time when waterfall projects were the thing, and we were doing database releases once or twice a year at most. This was extremely painful, extremely scary. It meant long nights, late nights, and long weekends, and it was terrible. And I never, ever want to go back to those days. And we finally got to a place at my previous employer where we were actually releasing on a monthly basis. And it was so much better. My relationship with the DBA team actually improved, and my just ability to learn from them also improved. Also, because we were releasing a month at a time, the scripts they needed to review were much shorter than a year's worth of SQL changes. And today, we know that teams are now releasing X times per day. So doing this manually is going to be really difficult. So today, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say database DevOps and what we're seeing out there. Also, why the database is so challenging and why it's been left behind in DevOps processes and at conferences. And then I wanted to talk about an open source solution called Flyway, which is a cross-platform multi-database migration script manager for automating database deployments. So we'll talk a little bit about what Flyway is, and I'll give a quick demo of how this could be used as part of your version control process, your continuous integration, and continuous delivery process. Has anyone heard of Flyway before? Okay, just a few hands. Great. Has anyone heard of Patrick Dubois? Basically known as the founder of DevOps. So has anybody seen the seminal 10 plus deploys per day at Flickr back at the Velocity Conference 2009? So this was basically the start of the DevOps movement, and it's a great presentation. It's still really, really practical for today. And Patrick Dubois was watching that, and he was really interested in enabling operations and operation teams to work in a more agile environment like he saw developers were doing. Once he saw that conference, he started the first DevOps days in 2009 in Belgium, which created the DevOps hashtag and the movement from there. So why I wanted to go back to Patrick Dubois as the founder of DevOps is really, this is a blog he wrote back in 2012 on what DevOps is. And really, DevOps in his perspective is the entire system. It's the entire, all the way from the business to the customer and the value, getting that to the customer. And a lot of times we just zoom in on DevOps, like the amalgamation of those two words, and developers and operations. And okay, DBAs are usually part of the operations team, so that is including DBAs when we're talking about DevOps. But I think a lot of the times they're forgotten about, and it's more about the sysadmins and the developers working together. But just kind of a reminder, setting the stage that it's more than just the dev and ops teams, it's everybody working together to deliver that business value. I also had the pleasure of meeting Gene Kim, the author of the Phoenix Project, back in 2016. Has anybody read the Phoenix Project book? Okay, great. So this is a novel about DevOps and how it could go wrong in a company and how they turned it around, trying to be more DevOps. But talking with Gene Kim, he was also stressing the importance of DBAs being included. And in the past, this has been a really siloed organization. There's always been this wall, this barrier between developers and DBAs. And I think there's very good reasons for that. DBAs are all about protecting that production environment, that production data. And there had to be kind of that wall between them. DevOps does not mean giving developers sysdba on your production databases. I want to create a meme for that. It's not just letting developers do it. It's breaking down that silo and working together. So, developers, especially Agile, Scrum, getting faster, talking about lean, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, developers are all about going fast and trying to get these releases out to their customers to learn from them. And they're not always that concerned with the operational aspect of it. It works in my environment, throw it over the wall, you take care of it. Whereas DBAs, they're really more about protecting that production data. There's all kinds of regulations out now, GDPR, California Privacy Act, serious fines for companies if things go wrong with the data. So anytime there's a release, anytime there's a change to production, that's risky. And then these DBAs haven't been involved in the changes. They don't understand, what changes are being made. It's usually like the night before, we're like, oh, we want to release this, and then the DBAs say, no, we have a maintenance window next Thursday, and then the developers are getting angry. So there's a lot of conflict between these two groups. And what we're trying to do is break down those silos, break down those barriers, and collaborate together. How many people in the room are developers? Okay, and how many are DBAs? Oh, not too many, okay. So hopefully we can break down those silos and work together more. And we actually, Redgate runs a State of Database DevOps survey. We've been running this for the past 3 years, and we've had over 1,000 respondents every year. So we're collecting this data to understand better the trends in the industry. This is a free report you can get from the website. And what we've been asking is, how are these silos going? And this year, 62% say the collaboration between the two teams are good and great. If we look at this data by teams that say that they're already doing DevOps practices in their organization, that number goes up to 76%. And we've just seen this trend continue to rise across the past 3 years, and I think it's going to continue. Another thing we currently see is the deployments are increasing. And we see this with things like the Dora, the State of DevOps report. We see there's more high performers that are releasing faster and faster. And again, a lot of these systems are going to have back-end database systems. And this has gone back. There's over 40% of organizations now deploying changes at least once a week, sometimes daily. And this is up from 35% last year. We've also asked, is the database part of an automated build and delivery process? And 66%, the database is not included. So this is just causing a bottleneck because as faster and faster as the application developers are releasing, if the database isn't automated, it's going to be that bottleneck. It's going to be the blocker to delivering value to your users. And this is one thing Gene Kim talks about finding the constraints. And you want to find, where's your biggest blocker because you need to fix that in order to increase the flow through the entire system. So this is what we see. We see, development. You have your developers working on development database code. The code's going into a version control system. The code's being automatically built, tested, getting deployed to test environments. And we kind of have this, possibly a separate test database management, and the guy up there is scratching his head because he just got this script that he has to run. And then your code is going through a nice automated process getting released to your production environment. But that database is this silo, it's this completely separate process, it's this manual, error-prone, very scary, very risky process. So what we'd like to see is both the application changes and the database changes going into a version control system. Whatever version control system you're currently using for your application, having that build in your continuous integration environment, doing things like automated testing on the database, doing things like code analysis on the database, best practices checks, all of those things can be automated. From there, it can be released to a QA environment, all automated, no manual errors, no using the wrong connection string, connecting to the wrong environment. And from there, a push of a button to production. So I still kind of have the DBA in there. A lot of release management orchestration tools, have this manual review step. And the easier we can make it for DBAs to get notified of the changes that are really risky, the changes that are involving complex data changes, the changes that are, any kind of deleting data, dropping data, those are the issues, the changes that we want to be brought to the forefront so DBAs can be involved. Ideally, we get the DBAs involved even earlier in the development side to shift things left, catch things earlier. So what was really great in the last 2018, this is the Accelerate State of DevOps report from Dora and the Google Cloud. Have you guys seen this report? So the Dora is the DevOps Research and Assessment Group. They've been doing a State of DevOps survey for the past 5 years. Last year was the first time they actually asked about the database and included it as part of their research. And what they found was, if you're including your database in your technical practices that are going into your continuous delivery environment, that's actually an indicator that it's positively contributing to your software development, which contributes to your your business performance. So it was really great to see that, even Dora is starting to think about database. What they said in the report is database changes should be scripted in version control, the same way as production application changes. It's also important that the people responsible for the database are brought into this, into the team earlier, and also having it as part of the process really increases the visibility of what changes are happening to your database. So these were all things that the report found that contributes to, continuous delivery, better organizational outcomes. So why is it so hard? Why has the database kind of been left behind? And obviously it's because of that production data. Every release, every change to a production database is risky. Especially, again, if the DBAs haven't been involved, a lot of times developers just don't have the skill set. They could write some update SQL statements, but do they understand the production system? Do they understand the performance that's going to happen? So one of the ways to help with this is to really get automation in place, getting your database as part of your version control system, as part of your continuous integration, continuous delivery. And I was talking about static code analysis. So things that I like to check, are making sure that users aren't being created, permissions aren't being changed, making sure that best practices are being followed. So there's a lot of information on the web about best practices. If you're using SQL Server, stored procedures shouldn't start with SP_ because that's a performance issue. Select star is pretty much a golden rule across all databases. You only want to return the data that is necessary to be returned. So there are best practices that could be put in place that can be automated as part of a release process that is checking every database change that goes through the system. So to me, I kind of think of this as like regression testing and static code analysis testing and making sure that releases aren't going to cause a problem. Another big thing for databases is test data management. So the more realistic the test data in your earlier upstream environments, development, test, QA, the more likely you are to catch problems, especially before they go to production. So a little story. Again, this was about 20 years ago, so please forgive me. But I was working on a greenfield database project, and it was handling employee data. So I was, the database developer. I had full access over the development environment. In my employee table, in my development database, I hand-entered me and 5 of my friends' names. And that was my test data that I was using in development. This was being deployed out to a production system that had over 300,000 employee records in that table. And 2 weeks before we went live, we actually acquired another company. So our employee data set now was over 1 million records in production. And I was working off a 5-record data set in my development environment. So needless to say, there was a lot of performance issues and a lot of rework that had to be done. And if I had a more realistic data set in development, I would have spotted those issues sooner. So we also, in our State of Database DevOps report, we asked customers, what are they doing? A lot of customers are taking a copy of production environment, which is great, right? Because you have that realistic data size and you have realistic data. But the scary thing is really about the privacy issues with the production data. So think about things like data masking tools. Other times people will do something where they have a backup of the production database, but they cleanse the data, and then they use that cleansed backup as a restore down to your upstream environments like development and test. Some teams use data generation tools to generate data. Others maintain scripts of data insert statements or data load from Excel files for their downstream environments. But I'd really encourage you guys to think about what data is being used and how can you make sure realistic data is being used earlier, but also keep your production's data safe. Another problem we see is called database drift. So this is when you think your production version is at one state, but there was a hot fix and somebody emergency patched it, and that didn't get communicated back. So the next time the developers deploy something, they're overwriting or undoing that patch. Happens a lot. And actually, I see as more and more teams automate their database release pipeline, that this is happening less so because it's super quick to have something flow through the system and follow the normal processes to get things out. Now, I'll be the first to admit that can't always happen. If your production system is on fire, you want to fix that right away. It's up to really the DBA and the change because it might be actually more risky to try to hack something on prod live to fix it quickly versus having some kind of rollback, recovery, maintenance mode type of thing. But yeah, if you are making changes in production, I feel like there's a few ways to tackle this. So one, make sure production is locked down. Again, I don't advocate giving sysDBA rights to devs in prod. So if your production environment is locked down, the possibility of these changes is going to be more limited. And then, just open the conversation. If changes are made, how do you make sure it's communicated back into your team? How do you make sure it gets back into a version control system? How do you make sure that the next release isn't going to overwrite and undo those changes? Another problem with database deployments, and I don't think this is really a problem with application, is zero downtime. So if you have a database that requires 5 nines, it has to be up all the time. I have like a frowny face there because this is really, really hard, especially as the sizes of database just gets larger and larger, terabytes. It's really hard to do a backup and restore if you have 5 nines. So this is why it's important, again, to get that DBA involved early, to think about the recovery as part of the release. So if something does go wrong, how will you recover? Do you have a rollback script? Do you have a roll forward script? Are you in the situation where you can back up and restore? Do you have a good understanding of the peaks and downtimes on your system? Can you time a release at a more off-peak hour so that if something does change and go wrong, there is less impact? Another thing that I see teams do here is think about the database being backwards compatible. So if you roll out the database changes first and you still have the old application pointing to it, if you upgrade the application and there's a problem, you can downgrade the application, everything's still set in the database, but the application's back to working. So a lot of teams are starting to think about this. How can I make my database backwards compatible? Therefore, if there is a problem, I can downgrade, I can keep working, and then I can figure out, hey, what happened to the data in between? Is there anything I need to do? Do I need to script it off? So backwards compatibility could be a good thing. I think this also helps with feature flags, if anybody's doing feature flags. Does everybody know what feature flags is? So feature flags is almost like testing in production, where you can roll out application code and then have some people turn a flag on which see a different feature and others don't see that feature. It also helps with canary releases. So if you're rolling out something to a subset of your users. They could be on application 1.1, where other users are still on application 1.0, but they're both talking to the same database. So thinking about that backwards compatibility can really help. This also leads into things with, there's a book called Refactoring Databases, which goes in a lot about how to do complex database changes. So things, if you want to split a column, you might not be able to do that in one go if there's a lot of data in that table. You might have to follow a pattern. It's called expand, contract. So you create the new columns that you want while the old columns still exist. Then you have a batch upgrade running in the background that's maybe limited to so many records at a time. Maybe it runs off hours in a background thread. You're updating that in the background. Once everything's switched over and copied over, there's also a trigger you put on your database so both columns are getting populated. Once everything's switched over, then you can delete the old columns and you're now in your new refactored state. So yeah, if you guys are doing a lot of in-depth database manipulation in agile environments, I really recommend that book, Refactoring Databases. Rolling back is also really hard, and we talked about this. I was lucky back in my days, our databases were really small. We had maintenance windows. I could take the database in single user mode, and no changes were gonna make to my database until I released it back into multi-user mode. And I had a backup, and I tested my backup could be restored. So to me, this was really great because if anything went wrong, I just restored my database, put my old application back, went home, and then we'd figure it out the next week when we had our next maintenance window. But this is really hard, and this is why I think it's really important that as part of your release process, you get the DBA involved, you understand the recovery. Sometimes for changes that are just stored procedure, you can get back to the old stored procedure version really quickly. If you're doing something more complicated with table changes or data changes, that's when more thought needs to be put into them. So knowing all those challenges, and hopefully I've given you some advice about how to tackle some of them, it is still possible. So I wanted to talk about Flyway, which is an open source solution. And it's been downloaded over 11 million times last year, which is really great. Complete transparency, my company Redgate, we did just acquire this 2 weeks ago, but we're committed to the open source community and to the community edition of Flyway. So we're really excited about this because Redgate in the past really been focused on SQL Server. This allows us to support 18 different databases. Just out of curiosity, how many people here are using Oracle? SQL Server? MySQL? Postgres? Okay, so good. Anything else? DB2. Okay. And yeah, I'm really focused on this talk about relational database systems, but we have all kinds of new, NoSQL, MongoDB, Cosmos DB, Hadoop, all kinds of different things coming into play as well in environments. What I really like about Flyway, so Flyway is cross-platform, Linux, Mac, Windows. And again, it supports these 18 different databases, both on-prem and in the cloud. And what it does is it manages understanding what scripts have been applied to a target database and automatically applies scripts, so it helps with the update process. The scripts can be written in just plain SQL for the database that you're using. So there's no kind of proprietary language or lock-in or anything like that. And basically, anything you can do in SQL, this tool allows you to do. So if you're currently writing SQL scripts and applying them manually, it's the same scripts that are running, just going to be applied automatically. So how it works is it adds an additional table to your database, to your schema, called a Flyway schema history table, where it tracks what migration scripts have already been ran against the database, who ran them, when they were ran, how long they took to run. which could be a nice way to test this in a pre-prod staging environment before going to production. And it basically just is a history of what migration scripts have been applied to your database, so that the next time you do a release, it'll say, here are all the migration scripts that haven't been applied yet. Let me execute those. There are 6 basic commands when it comes to Flyway. 2 of the most popular ones, or 2 of the ones that you use all the time, is called info. And info is basically taking that Flyway history table plus any migration scripts in your file system or in your class path, and it's giving you a status information about what's the current state of your database, what scripts have already been applied, which ones are pending that need to be applied. So this is used a lot. And the other most common command is migrate. So simply saying Flyway migrate, any of those scripts that were pending when you did the info are just going to be executed on the target database. And along with putting an additional record in your Flyway schema history table to acknowledge the fact that, hey, these scripts have been ran on your database. Another really important command is baseline. So this is if you're ever working with existing databases, you want to be able to put a baseline, a line in the sand of this is where production is, apply all these migration scripts going forward. So Flyway will work with greenfield projects, but also with existing databases. What's important to do if you want to spin up a new developer environment or a new test environment, it's important to take your production database and kind of script that out in a version 0.0, a baseline file. So if you ever want to call Flyway migrate in a new test environment, it'll, because nothing exists there yet, it'll apply the baseline, which is kind of getting it up to the state of production at this point in time, and then apply all the migrations on top of it. So I kind of think of baseline as 2 things. Baseline is just kind of putting the Flyway schema history in and saying this is the baseline of my production. But you also need to make sure if you want to spin up new environments for dev and test, if you want to get all the way up to that point, that you create a baseline script that can be applied when you're calling Flyway migrate. And then the most important thing is that's not applied to your production environment, because if it is and it's not written idempotently, then it's just going to fail. Another command which developers get really excited about is clean. This kind of scares me because there is no warning. Calling Flyway clean just drops everything in your schema. So obviously, never, ever, ever use this on production. But the idea about this is it's really great for developers. It's really great if they just want to get back to a fresh start. Again, it would apply that baseline, any additional migration scripts, and provide a fresh environment for them to work against. Also can be used in CI systems or in test environments if you want a brand new database from scratch. If you're testing, deploying this database to a new client, you want to be able to build it from scratch, so clean is a great way to do that. Another command is called validate. And all validate is doing is it's checking that the information in the Flyway schema history table matches the scripts that are still on disk. If there's any files on disk that the checksum has changed, it'll give you warnings. If there's any files on disk that are no longer in the system for some reason, it tells you things are missing. So it's just a way to validate that everything that's been applied to the database still matches the scripts in my file system. And finally, there's also repair. And repair is allowing you to, if for some reason the checksum did change on the SQL script, repair is saying, I know I did this change, update it, everything's okay now. So it's repairing that Flyway schema history so that the validation will work so that you can call migrate. And that's basically it. The 6 Flyway commands that'll let you, find out information about what's been applied to the database, migrate the database changes, set baselines, clean for dev test environments, validate and repair. Flyway has a few different integrations. If you're doing Java application development, a lot of teams will just include it as part of their Java applications, and then the migrations can actually run on startup, so your application is actually updating the database. It also integrates with Gradle or Maven, or via the command line. And what I'm going to show you today is just command line steps that I've integrated into Jenkins, a CI system, to automate this through a pipeline. Flyway also has a container on Docker Hub, and this seems to be getting a lot of momentum as just pulling the Docker container into your CI/CD system and using Flyway through that. So that's actually something really exciting that I think we're going to see more and more of. So some best practices when using Flyway. Once you have this automated process set up, it's recommended that you don't make changes outside of the Flyway process, because Flyway is going to get confused. Flyway is going to, it might think the checksum is different. Again, you might get into that situation where you change something on production, but then the next time you run Flyway migrate, it's going to overwrite it. So making changes outside the process is pretty risky. Again, I think sometimes it has to be done, but I would just make sure that if you're making changes outside, you really know what you're doing. You put an idempotent script back in the version control system so that that change is applied to your upstream environments, but then when it comes time to production, it just gets marked in the Flyway schema history table that that script's been there, but it doesn't actually try to recreate the index, which would obviously fail or something like that. Another piece of advice I've heard from working with teams that are using Flyway is that they don't want to change the scripts after it's been deployed to their other environments. Again, this is just going to cause a problem with Flyway because the checksum is going to differ. Now, if you're using that clean technique, where you clean your other environments and then reapply, this is okay. But once, if the script has already made it to production, we usually talk about a roll-forward approach and putting a new script in that fixes it and gets deployed through the pipeline. Flyway has a certain naming convention where it just starts with V for version, and then you give it an incremental number. And that number, again, Flyway just applies those scripts in the order of the number. So we kind of learned the hard way. Don't start with V1.1. Put some zeros in there. Depending on how many scripts you have, you might get to 10 pretty quickly. So the leading zeros are always a good thing. The other thing we learned is if you're on a large team and lots of people are making migration scripts at once, if version 1's in the repository, I'm going to create a script that says version 2, you're going to create a script that says version 2. There's going to be a conflict. So a lot of teams instead use a year, month, day, hour, minute, second kind of naming convention. It doesn't look that pretty, but it gets the job done to make sure that there's no conflicts based on both files having the same name. Another thing you might have to do if you're branching and, let's say I have a version of, because year, month, day is too long, I'm just going to use version 3, and you have version 4. And let's say I push, or you push your change first, so version 4. By default, Flyway only adds higher number migrations. So once I push version 3, Flyway is actually going to ignore it because it already thinks it's at version 4. And there's a configuration setting in Flyway to turn on out-of-order migrations. You just set that to true, and all of a sudden, it doesn't matter. It'll always apply any migration script that hasn't been run against the target yet. So this is a way to make sure that you, can work out of order and merge things in with feature branches and still have your deployment pipeline go. Another thing that I've seen that's really nice is the ability to use separate folders for different environments. So on my test environment, I might point Flyway to my main schema updates, but I might also have another folder for test data scripts that I want to run on my test environment, but I don't want to run on my production system. So just creating separate folders, that works really well. Also, if I have any client-specific customer data, I can put that in separate folders, and then for each client, I just pull the folder specific to them, and that, again, automates my release. Repeatable migrations, this is a feature in Flyway. So a version migration runs on the target database if it hasn't been applied yet. A repeatable migration will run anytime the checksum changes. So some teams use this for stored procedures, some teams use this for data insert scripts. I don't know if it's a best practice. There was a lot of debate around this when I was putting these slides together, but it's kind of a tip because a lot of people don't know about this feature in Flyway, and the teams that I've worked with that have used it have really found it valuable. So just wanted to kind of make you guys aware of it, and if it will work in your environment for something, then it's good to know. Be careful with users. Again, a lot of times we don't want to create a new user in a migration script because then it would have the same password throughout your dev, test, prod environment. So a lot of times we just manage the users completely outside of this process so that the passwords can be controlled and not the same across your environments. And then the big thing for me is just testing on a staging environment. So again, if your staging environment is as close as possible to your production environment, that's going to really give you the insight. That's going to give you a true dry run, a test of your migration, and make sure you're finding problems early before they go to production. So, a quick demo. What we're going to do is script some changes and apply them to a development database using Flyway. From there, we'll commit and push those changes into a version control system. That's going to be picked up by our CI process, use Flyway to deploy to a CI environment that gets cleaned, and then deployed to another environment. What I really like about this is it's a repeatable process. The same script that I'm using in development is being used throughout the pipeline. So it's being tested, it's consistent. If there are any problems, I need to figure out what to do. But at least I know that this script I ran in dev is going to be the same in production. And there's not that kind of manual, let me just tweak it along the way, and then it gets applied to one environment, but then the tweak didn't make it to the production environment. So the other thing I really like about this is that I can now include it as part of my code review process or pull request reviews. So, and I can actually say, I want DBAs to do the pull request review for database changes, and I can get them involved earlier. So let's see. Okay, great. So in this environment, I have a development database. I have this contacts table, which is just tracking some information, first name, last name, address. If I go to the Flyway command line, and I'm just going to run that info command, I hope you can see that. So I'm just typing info, and I'm saying, which schema is my development schema. I can then see, I've already baselined this database, and I've already ran one repeatable migration get contacts, which all that is a stored procedure. If I look in my version control system, I can see that procedure here. It's a create or replace. So anytime this script changes, it's going to execute that on my target environment. So in my version control system, I've just kind of defined all my database scripts will be kept here. So that's my baseline script. So if I want to make a change to my database, let's say, and I just already scripted this out so you didn't have to watch me type. I have a script here that I'm just going to drop into my working folder for my version control system. So using the Flyway convention, but not my best practice, I didn't put the leading zeros in. I just created a new script that's going to alter that table employees and add the Twitter ID. So I'll go ahead and then also in my procedure, what I want to do is I want to update it. Okay, I'm noticing the select star, so that's not good. I want to update it to include just the columns I need from the context table along with that new Twitter ID. So I'll go ahead and save that. So this is just saved, on my local file system in my working folder of my version control system. So if I use Flyway info again, I can see that my baseline is already there. The Git context has been outdated because I've updated that. And I have this new script Twitter ID and Git context. So all I do now, so this hasn't been added to version control. This is my local working folder. So what I'm going to do now is just use Flyway migrate. That's going to, again, tell me I'm currently at HR Dev 1, and I'm going to update and do the new Twitter ID and run the repeatable migrations Git contacts. So if I go back to my database and refresh, just refresh. And it's not there, but I think it should be there. I can now see I have this Flyway schema history table, and if I look at the data in that, I can see my new Twitter ID is there along with the Git contacts, has been updated in my development database. So once I'm happy with that and tested that, I'll go using my same version control system that I'm using. I'm just going to commit and push this. So I want to do both the Git context and the Twitter ID. I'll create a good comment. And I'll commit and push that into my version control system. Once that's in my version control system, Jenkins should pick that up as a change. I have it pulling so often, so I'll just kick it off now. And all this is doing, this is just a simple pipeline that I set up, but this is just calling two steps. One to build the database, which again, all that's doing, and sorry if it's hard to see on here, but all that's doing is a clean, migrate the CI database to the latest version. So it's upgrading this HR integration 1. It's running the new Twitter ID and Git contacts. And that's my integration data. So sorry, on the build step, it's running the clean, which is here, Flyway clean, if you can see that. And then it's migrating it. And then once that passes, and let's say my code analysis tests are set up, maybe I'm doing unit testing as well. There's open source unit testing frameworks for database, T-SQL-T for SQL Server, UTPL SQL for Oracle. So once all those tests pass, then I deploy it to my integration environment. So if I go back to my database, and if I look at my integration server, I can now see, yeah, the Flyway schema is here, and if I open the context here and look at the columns, it's still not there, which is surprising, but it is possible. I'm gonna have to, was there a warning? Yeah, I think that was just a compile issue, but I might have, had an error in the script. But because we have 2 minutes left, I can try to debug it in a second, but I just want to kind of get to the summary slides. So database DevOps, including your database as part of your pipeline, it is possible. Flyway is one solution out there, an open source solution. And general, just best practices, more from a database DevOps. Let's see from the current slide. I have too many slides. So just to take away, I wanted to just kind of bring back some best practices. Again, DevOps is all about communication, collaboration, breaking down those silos. Get your DBAs involved. This is a lot easier said than done. I especially advocate, like, maybe it's more about, if you're gonna have developers making database changes, maybe it's more about getting them training, getting them, the realistic test data, and just getting them to get DBAs involved for the really complex changes. Include your database in version control, testing, CI/CD practices. If your teams are going faster and faster, releasing X times a day, you need to kind of automate this to make sure that your database isn't going to be the bottleneck, isn't going to be the thing that's slowing down the pipeline. Again, use realistic data in your test environments. I can't stress this enough. I think my previous experience just really burned me there. If it is at all possible, have a staging pre-production environment that's as close to production as possible. You want, to have that test before you go to production. You want to know if it's going to take, hours versus minutes. All these things can be found in a staging or pre-production environment. And most importantly, know how you will recover. So again, I have my contact details up there if you guys have any questions afterwards. I also have my colleague in the room, Devin. Because this is the last session of the day, we have a half hour, so we're going to stick around up here. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to come up and ask any questions. And yeah, if you have any questions afterwards, I'm happy to chat on Twitter or through email. So the last slide, sure. Thank you. Thank you.